That was really good. Okay, well, we're going to continue on. I'm going to read a little introduction on the back of this book about aMY Goodman. aMY Goodman has been confronting the Washington establishment and its corporate sponsors while giving voice to the ordinary citizens and activists who are fighting for a better, more peaceful world. Her daily international radio and TV show, Democracy Now!, began in 1996 and is now carried on about 500 stations and democracynow.org. It is the largest media collaboration in North American public broadcasting. Democracy Now! Is more than a show, it's a movement. And let's thank aMY Goodman for being here, and she's going to talk right now. So.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks to the Uprising group that is really putting in a lot of effort to educate people, and especially to Toby and Charlie. It's not easy to go through it once, let alone to go through it over and over again, and to talk about their experiences here so that other people don't have to go through what they went through. We actually write about Charlie in Static, so it was really nice to see him again. I've seen him a few times, one of those times in Crawford, Texas, last summer. Well, it's really great to be with all of you. We're on an 80-city tour. Usually I'm with my brother, David. He wrote Static with me. We are traveling around the country since Labor Day. We're honoring 10 years of Democracy Now! We began in 1996 as the only daily election show in public broadcasting. And for some reason, well, we were going to end at the end of the election, but there was more demand for it after the election than before, and it just started to grow. Democracy Now! Was on Pacifica stations and community stations. Then in 2001, we expanded to television. And now we're broadcasting on 500 public radio and television stations around the country, a daily, grassroots, global, unembedded, international, independent news hour. On Pacifica stations, on NPR stations increasingly, on low-power FM stations, college and community radio stations, on public access TV stations, on PBS stations, and on both TV satellite networks, on Dish Network Channel 9415 Free Speech TV, 9410 Link TV, and on DirecTV Channel 375. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. Our headlines are in Spanish and audio and transcript form, so any radio station can run them. Special thanks to WRUW that runs Democracy Now! And also Village Channel, is it 20? That has been running us. I think they're going through some transition. But hopefully they will have us back on. And we are also handing out the Democracy Now! Daily Digest list. And special thanks to Gene Katerba. He's got them. Maybe you could just pass them around. This is for you to get our daily headlines and stories, and also it will be shared with the DN in Northeast, DN to Northeast Ohio group. Is Vicki Lovgren here also? There's Vicki, who's been working hard on bringing Democracy Now! Consistently here on public radio and public television. And one of the big things, you can talk to her, but one of the big things we do all over in this 80-city tour is holding fundraisers for independent media, because we have to shore up independent media. There is no time that is more important than now, than in a time of war. We called the book Static because in this high-tech age of digital radio and high-definition television, when we're supposed to get an ever clearer, crisper picture and sound, all we get is ever more static. That's a veil of distortion and lies and misrepresentations and half-truths and omissions that obscure the truth. When what we should be getting is the dictionary definition of static. That's what the media should be bringing us. Opposition, criticism, unwanted interference. We're supposed to be covering power, not covering for power. We're supposed to be the fourth estate. We're supposed to be the fourth estate, not for the state. And we are supposed to be covering the movements that create static and make history. It's absolutely critical that we have a media that is there to represent the views of most people in this country. What we have seen over and over again is the small circle of pundits who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. We need a different kind of media. The media are the most powerful institutions on earth, more powerful than any bomb, more powerful than any missile, and the Pentagon's deployed the media, and we have to take it back. It doesn't serve the generals to have a media that is a part of the state rather than separate from it. It certainly doesn't serve the soldiers. It doesn't serve civilian society. It doesn't serve a democratic society. We began our trip Labor Day weekend in Cape Cod. The first night was in Provincetown, and we were celebrating their WOMR Outermost Radio. And then we moved on to Nantucket. And Nantucket is an historic island. It's the place where Frederick Douglass gave one of his first speeches against slavery for abolition. He trembled when he spoke. His body shook because he spoke from his own experience. He had been enslaved as a child and as a teenager. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland, and he ended up in the hands of Edward Covey, who was known as a slave breaker. The other slave owners would hand over their troublesome slaves to Covey. Covey's property was called Mount Misery. He almost broke Frederick Douglass, but Frederick Douglass broke away. He went north, and he changed the world. That property in Maryland, Mount Misery, is today owned by Donald Rumsfeld. It's his vacation home. He bought it in 2003 to be just down the road, about a quarter mile down the road from his close friend, Vice President Dick Cheney. That's what I was thinking about in Nantucket. The night before, I was in Provincetown, and I was speaking at Provincetown High School. So we came up to the school. It was just getting dark, and there was this pickup truck in front of the school. And I was mounting the steps. I saw in the truck bed there was a coffin, and there was a couple standing next to it. Their names were Carlos and Melita Arredondo. And they spoke very quickly as I was heading in to speak to tell their story. Carlos said, it was August 25th, 2004. They had moved to Florida. It was his birthday. He was home with his mother. Melita was out, and a Marine van pulled up. And he thought maybe it was his older son, Alex, who was in Iraq, maybe coming back to surprise him for his birthday. But it was the Marines. They got out, and they informed him that his son, Alex, was dead. He died in the ancient Iraqi city of Najaf at the age of 20 years and 20 days old. And Carlos lost his mind. He went into a frenzy. He asked the Marines to leave. They didn't. He begged them to leave. They didn't. So he raced into the garage, and he got out some cans of gas and a blowtorch. He asked them to leave again. They didn't. So he went to their van, and he started to destroy it. He got gasoline all over the inside of it, over himself. His mother ran out and was trying to pull him out of the van, and that triggered the blowtorch, and the whole thing blew up. At which point, Melita pulled up, his wife, in a car. And she saw her husband burning on the lawn, and that's how she learned that her stepson, Alex, was dead. And then in the midst of all of this commotion, their younger son, Brian, called. He was on summer vacation in Maine to wish his dad a happy birthday. And someone picked up the phone. He heard all of this commotion, and he heard something about the media being there. He turned on the television, and he saw his father burning on national television. And that's how he learned that his older brother, who he emulated and loved and wanted to be like, was dead. No judgment, just one story in a time of war. Well, it's taken Carlos a long time to heal. The physical is the easy part. He's burned on over a quarter of his body. But it wasn't until a year later, in August 2005, when Cindy Sheehan went to Crawford, that Carlos found his voice. Cindy Sheehan, August 5th, 2005. She's speaking at the Dallas Veterans for Peace Convention. And spontaneously she says she can't enjoy another vacation because her son, Casey, was killed in Sadr City, April 4th, 2004, 4:04:04, she says. And so she said, well, she was in Dallas anyway. She would head to Crawford. She said, since I'm in Texas, I mean, how far can it be? And she would go to where the president was vacationing. And she wanted to ask him one question. For what noble cause did my son die? So the next morning, she headed out in a small caravan of veterans, and they made their way to Crawford, and she took up residence in the ditch outside the presidential estate. We won't call it a ranch, because it isn't. And she just stayed there. Now, the White House press corps, not known for its independence that follows the president everywhere, was in Crawford. They're used to enjoying what we call, and by the way, I wrote this book with my brother, David Goodman, who is an investigative journalist as well. And I was lucky enough to have a friend and I hesitate to use the word these days, a collaborator who also happens to be my brother. But we call this access that they have so long enjoyed the access of evil. That's trading truth for access. And that's what they're used to, this embedded White House press corps. But they weren't getting this kind of access in the middle of a Texas summer with the president on one of the longest vacations in presidential history. So beware of even this embedded press corps in 110-degree weather day after day, not enjoying the access of evil. And right next to them, this persistent, relentless woman who won't stop with this question. For what noble cause did my son die? So they took up her call and they asked the president, why won't he meet, they asked, with this grieving mother? And he answered them. That's the power of the press when they ask the question, especially if when they do follow up and they really push to get a question answered. He answered them. He said, President Bush said, I have to get on with my life too. And the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reported that day that he went mountain bike riding for 2 hours. He fished, he napped. I think he took in a Little League luncheon, and apparently they said he did some reading. But he didn't have time for Cindy, and she didn't give up. The White House press corps turned to her and said, you're so eloquent, you're so articulate, why haven't you spoken out before? And she said, I have been speaking, you just haven't been listening. Now, if you are regular listeners or viewers of Democracy Now!, how many of you listen to Democracy Now! On WRUW? Podcasting. How many of you watch Democracy Now! On Village? Online. On Dish Network, Free Speech TV? On Link TV? On Direct TV? Well, if you watch, listened, or read Democracy Now!, you have heard Cindy before Crawford. For example, Inauguration Day, January 2005. Democracy Now! Headed to Washington to cover what was happening there. And Cindy Sheehan was there along with Celeste Zapala. She lost her son, Sherwood Baker, the first Pennsylvania National Guardsman to die since World War II. And they, together with others, founded Gold Star Families for Peace. And they called ahead to the Pentagon. They wanted to meet with Donald Rumsfeld, and he didn't get back to them. The Pentagon didn't, but they decided they'd make a small pilgrimage to the Pentagon. And they tried. This was right on the eve of the inauguration. And as they made their way to the Pentagon parking lot, were they met by an envoy from the secretary maybe to say he's not available, but do you want to pass on some message? or perhaps even invited into the Pentagon on these cold, nasty days in Washington, the cold, nasty days in Washington for some hot cider. I mean, these are mourning mothers. No. They were met by black-clad Pentagon security, and they were turned back at gunpoint. Well, beware of mothers who have nothing left to lose. And so it was a few months later that Cindy headed down to Crawford, and she became a magnet for so many. People like Nadja McCaffrey. Nadja's son is named Patrick, and she lives just outside Sacramento. We were just in Sacramento last Saturday celebrating KVMR radio. That's Victorian Museum Radio that broadcast Democracy Now! In Nevada City and Sacramento. And then later that night we were with Cindy Sheehan in Palo Alto. And then we headed on to Dearborn the next morning, and that's where I met Max Bax, and it's great to be here with an independent bookstore, and I thank Suzanne for being a part of this at this late notice. It's very, very important when I talk about independent media, independent radio, television. Also, I've really come to appreciate independent bookstores all over this country. They are a critical part of the independent media landscape. They are a part of these sanctuaries of dissent that we must celebrate and support, or we will lose them. But Nadja McCaffrey lives outside Sacramento. Her son signed up in the military after 9/11, Patrick, because he felt in a time of attack or natural catastrophe, he wanted to be there for his country. He had a wife, 2 kids, felt like he had the perfect life and wanted to give back. Then he's called up to go to Iraq, and he doesn't understand how this fits in with this idea of protecting this country. He sits with his mother for hours. She doesn't want him to go. In the end, he decides to go because he wants to be there to protect his buddies in his unit. And he feels that's the right thing to do. I come from New York, and my governor is George Pataki, and he visited Iraq. He came back, and he said that he wants to take a piece of Saddam Hussein's statue and embed it in the foundation of a new World Trade Center. Now, if he does that, that will be the first proven link between 9/11 and Iraq. Well, Patrick went to Iraq, and he wrote home for deflated soccer balls and candy for the Iraqi kids. He ultimately was killed in Iraq. And when his casket was sent home, his mother, Nadja, engaged in a defiant act. She invited the press to Sacramento International Airport. Why defiant? Well, because President Bush has invoked this executive order that says you can't film, photograph, videotape the flag-draped coffins of soldiers coming home. Well, she encouraged the photographers to snap away. She encouraged the videographers to turn on their cameras. She told the filmmakers to film. She said, "My son didn't go to Iraq in darkness. I don't want him returning in darkness." That's how she chose to memorialize her son. She later headed to Crawford. And then there was Patricia Roberts. She's from Georgia. Her son, Jamal Addison, is the first Georgia National Guardsman, I think it was, to die since World War II. And she set up a fund in honor of him so that young African Americans would have an opportunity to go to college without detouring through Iraq. And then there was Becky Lowry. She's a state senator from Minnesota. And I learned about her 2 Memorial Day weekends ago. I was giving the commencement address at Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin. And I was driving up through Minneapolis, and I picked up a copy of the local paper, the Pioneer Press. And I saw there was a headline in this paper that said, "A Death in the Family." And it was about Becky Lowry. She's a state senator who, before the invasion, introduced an anti-war resolution. She confronted Donald Rumsfeld at a national conference of state legislators around the no-bid Halliburton contract, saying they were doing no good for the soldiers in Iraq. But that's really not what this article was about. It was about the fact that her son, Matt, was killed in Iraq 2 Memorial Day weekends ago. She headed to Crawford. And of course, Democracy Now! Went to Crawford. We broadcast from right near that ditch outside the presidential estate. And we interviewed these mothers. We interviewed Charlie. And we have that DVD. We have a few of those DVDs here from the place that will now forever be known as Cindy's Crawford. But State Senator Lowry said, with our children dying, who will be the future leaders of this country? Well, I think Nadja and Becky, Cindy, Patricia, Charlie, these are the future leaders of this country. I want to go back to Carlos, because he was inspired by what Cindy did. Hundreds and thousands went to Crawford. What Carlos decided to do was drag a coffin around the country. He dragged it over Capitol Hill and spoke with Congress members. He went to Waco. He went to Crawford. He came up to Provincetown. This last Labor Day was, the last bash of people going off to school and work. But there was this coffin coming down Main Street. He said, if the war doesn't go on vacation, neither do I. And he had these loose leaf notebooks of documents. And I quickly went through them, and I found one. It was from the Army National Guard. Their son, Brian, the younger son, is being aggressively recruited to go to Iraq. And it starts off by saying, "Dear American." And that's interesting because, Carlos is not an American. He's from Costa Rica, where they don't have an army, but he wants to be an American citizen. He's applied, hasn't managed to get it yet. I mean, it's not as if he hasn't given the greatest sacrifice an American citizen could give, more than his own life, the life of his child. But he just hasn't managed to merit it yet. It goes on, it starts off by saying, by urging you to serve in times like Katrina. Now that's very interesting, because when you think about what happened, and it is horrifying what happened a year ago. We just passed the first anniversary. How is it we experience the drowning of an American city in the 21st century? Well, more than 1,500 people in New Orleans died. Would anywhere near that number have perished if the National Guard were not deployed to Iraq? I want to just talk about Katrina for a minute, because it certainly fits into this picture. Make no mistake about it, President Bush was fully briefed before Katrina hit by video conference at his vacation home. And they told him this could be the big one. This could be the greatest natural catastrophe the U.S. has ever seen. Now, you can't ever absolutely know, but what do leaders do? They prepare for the worst and they hope for the best. Did he fly off to Washington to prepare, to go to Florida, go near New Orleans to be in charge and command and control? No. He flew to California, and here he allowed photographs to be taken of the president riffing on the guitar of the country music star Mark Wills, whose signature song is "Wish You Were Here." Could have been the theme song of the people of New Orleans. And then he flew back to Crawford. I mean, the hurricane had hit, the levees were broken, but President Bush was not the only one. Vice President Cheney was in Wyoming. He was fly fishing. And through the weekend, Saturday, Sunday, did he come back? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I was speaking in Salt Lake City. Carrol is the community radio station there, and we were working with Sam Willer's Zion bookstore. And when I was signing books after, and I look forward to doing that with you, whether or not you get a book to talk to you, a young man came up to me, and he said he was working in a sushi shop in Jackson, Wyoming last summer. And they share a wall with the Secret Service of Cheney. And outside was Air Force Two. And he's watching New Orleans drown on TV. And he said he could not believe that the Secret Service remained and Air Force Two stayed, which meant Vice President Cheney was staying. He said his daughter would come in for sushi orders, and they watched this calamity And the plane stayed. And it wasn't just Cheney. Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State, was in my city, New York. She was doing some high-end shoe shopping at Ferragamo. And one of the customers yelled at her, "What are you doing shopping when these people are dropping in New Orleans?" And they took her out, the customer, that is. And she went to Broadway, saw Spamalot. She played some tennis with Monica Seles. And she wasn't the only one. Andrew Card, the chief of staff at the time, he's the former GM lobbyist. He was vacationing in New England, the former GM lobbyist, General Motors. Right, what we see in Washington is the ascendancy of the oligarchy. You have President Bush, a failed oil man himself. You have Vice President Cheney. He's the former head of the largest oil services corporation in the world. That's Halliburton. You have Condoleezza Rice. She sat on the board of Chevron for more than a decade, actually had an oil tanker named after her, the Condoleezza Rice. And then there's Andrew Card, the former GM lobbyist, who's no longer chief of staff, but was. Is it any surprise that they are thirsty for oil, that it's determining foreign policy from Iraq to Venezuela? You know the joke of the little boy who says to his dad, "What's our oil doing under their sand?" So, a side effect, though, of the Bush administration not responding was that when the corporate media did the right thing, and that was to go to New Orleans, there were no troops to embed with. And we saw perhaps the first time, one of the first times, the corporate media reporting from the victim's perspective. And it electrified this country. You'd see the bodies floating by on your TV screen. Immediately, the Bush administration leaped into action and said, "You are not to film the bodies." To which the editor of the Times-Picayune responded, "You've got to be kidding." And I remember seeing this young woman reporter who was standing in the water, and this man came up with his boy, and he had been in the attic, and he said he was holding his wife's hand, and as she slipped away, she said, "Take care of the children." He told the story, he turned around, and he waded off into the water in shock. And this young reporter started to cry. That's reporting from the victim's perspective. The response across this country, it didn't matter if you were a conservative, Republican, or a Democrat, or an independent, a green, a progressive, no difference. The differences were washed away. It was humanity responding to humanity. Could you imagine if for just 1 week we saw this kind of reporting in Iraq? We saw the babies dead on the ground. We saw the women with their legs blown off from cluster bombs from Iraq to Lebanon. We saw the soldiers dead and dying. For 1 week, Americans are a compassionate people. They would say no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. Back to Carlos and Melita, that letter. The letter goes on to say that it offers a $20,000 bonus if you sign up. And it says, what can you do with that money? You can buy a new car. You can pay off your credit cards. You can help your family. The money you earn serving your country is yours to spend. And then it says, the decision you make today will affect how the rest of your life turns out. Which is exactly why Carlos and Melita Arredondo were begging their son Brian not to go to Iraq. I wanted to tell you a story about a t-shirt. It's a story about a man named Raed Jarar, and we interviewed him a few weeks ago. He's an Iraqi architect. He's a blogger. He does this blog, raedinthemiddle.blogspot.com, analyzing what's going on in Iraq. And he moved here. He lives in San Francisco, actually just moved to Washington. And as we travel, we speak with different people in different places, and it has been amazing. And I'm very honored to be here today with Charlie and Toby and the group that is traveling across this country to just let people know to do what the media should be doing, just presenting the information, and then you make your own decision. When we were in Chicago speaking at Northwestern, as I was walking in, someone said, Tony Lagaranis is in the audience. Well, we write about Tony in this book. He's an Army interrogator. He went to Iraq, he worked at Abu Ghraib, he worked at Mosul. He came back. And we had him on Democracy Now! Right before the show. We had him in a Chicago studio, and we're TV, so it's, you know, you see the person in the studio. Right before we go on, he said, this isn't live, is it? I said, well, actually it is live. He said, I can't do it. I can't do it. I said, I think you can do it, because I had talked to family and friends of his, the people who had brought him to my attention. And he held forth for this hour about what was done, about the violations of the Geneva Conventions. And he ended by warning young soldiers. He said, if you're going to go, you've got to remember your values. You can't leave them here when you go there. Understand what the stakes are. Understand what the Geneva Conventions are. Understand what we didn't understand when we were there. And when we were in Seattle at Town Hall, more than 1,000 people packed out the place. And among those who spoke was Lieutenant Aaron Watada. He's the first officer to say no to deployment. And when he got up, the applause was thunderous, almost frightening. And you think of how alone he is in the community he has been in the military, and to come out into civilian society and face this very different kind of response. And just the day before, he'd been hit with the 4th charge of conduct unbecoming an officer, because he had spoken at the annual meeting of the Veterans for Peace Convention in Seattle. Conduct unbecoming. If we lived in a just society, who would be charged with conduct unbecoming? Last week, I was on the Colbert Report. Maybe some of you saw it. And Mr. Colbert asked me about this, you know, so-called whatever peace movement, whatever, you know. And I thought, I think the most powerful statement to make about the peace movement are the veterans, are the people who come back or refuse to go. And I talked about them as the peace movement. And I started by mentioning Sergeant Marshall Thompson in Utah. We were in Salt Lake City, and someone said to us, this is why it's so important, just go places. Have you heard about Marshall? I hadn't heard anything about Marshall. He's leaving, they said, in a day or two to walk across Utah. Utah is the most pro-Bush state in the country. It is the reddest state in the country. And someone told me there, I have to check this fact, while it is the reddest state in the country, it has the least percentage of people who are going to Iraq. And I find that very interesting. I don't absolutely know that it's true. But Sergeant Marshall Thompson did go to Iraq, and he was the editor of the Anaconda Times. He interviewed thousands of soldiers. He said they're overwhelmingly opposed to war. Where do we see anything about that in the media here? He came back and he thought, what could he do? And so he and his wife, he's the son of the ex-mayor of Logan, Utah. They decided to walk across Utah. And there's a website, Soldier's Peace, I think soldierspeace.org, just a picture of a soldier's boots. So I talked about him on Colbert Report. So then the next day I'm headed to Ashland, Oregon, and I'm stuck at San Francisco Airport because of the weather. And I get this call on my dying cell phone. And someone's saying, hello, hello, it's Marshall. I said, Marshall? He said, Sergeant Marshall Thompson. I can't believe you said my name on national television. I said, where are you? And he said, I'm walking. I mean, it takes a lot. Again, they live it once and they come back and they feel that they have to live it again so that many other people here won't go through this. So, talking about this t-shirt, and Raed, he was with us in Washington, D.C. when we were honoring WPFW, the Pacifica station there. But he was traveling from Kennedy Airport to San Francisco. This was just a few weeks ago. And he's just about to get on the plane, JetBlue, in Kennedy. And he is stopped by 4 transportation officials, 2 JetBlue, 2 TSA. And they tell him he can't go on the plane if he wears this T-shirt that he's wearing. You know how when you wake up in the morning and you throw something on, if you're anything like me, and you can't remember what it is that you're wearing, and so he looks down like, no stains, what's the problem? And they said it's threatening. Well, Raed was wearing this black T-shirt, and it said with white letters, "We will not be silent." And he said, "What's threatening about that?" And they said, "It's not the English, it's the Arabic script above it." And he said, "Oh, that's just Arabic for 'we will not be silent.'" And they said, "Well, we can't know that. We don't have a translator here." So he says, has Arabic become a terrorist language? They said wearing a T-shirt with Arabic script onto an American plane today is like walking into a bank with a T-shirt that says, "I am a robber." Now, he tried to argue this, and he talked about being a taxpayer here now, and he has rights, but you know, he's in an airport that's a little too close for comfort, like maybe being deported or something, and he doesn't know if he wants to go down on this one. Well, according to the TSA, it was the JetBlue official who went and bought him a T-shirt to cover his T-shirt with. I don't know if it said New York or I love New York, but, and he has to put this T-shirt on to go on the plane. And they escort him onto the plane before all the other passengers. He reserved early, he likes to sit in the front of the plane, but they escorted him to the back of the plane. And then they brought all the other passengers on, and that's how he flew to San Francisco. So we went with the story a few days later when we heard about it, and Raed came on and he told the story. And the next day, some women came into our studio, and they were all wearing this T-shirt. And they were in a big rush, and I said to them, "Where are you going?" They said, "We're headed to the airport." So I asked them, well, where were they going? And they said, "It doesn't matter, they're just getting on planes." You know, it's a very profound point. We don't have to agree with each other, but I think it is important to stand together. I was in Baraboo, Wisconsin a few weeks ago at the Fighting Bob Fest, and a girl came up to me, high school, wearing her high school sweatshirt, and its slogan, "Great minds don't think alike." I thought that was very cool. We don't have to agree with each other, but we do have to stand together to make it harder to target any individual. And right now, individuals and groups that are being most targeted in this country, well, always African Americans, but now Arab Americans, Muslims, people of South Asian descent. This country is the greatest democracy on earth for some, but for others it's a very frightening place right now. Thousands of people arrested since 9/11. Thousands. We don't know their names. They don't know the charges or the evidence against them. Many of them have been deported. Illegal detentions, torture. How is it that torture has come to represent this country? You know, when David and I wrote Static, I was nervous because it's months, you know, we have to finish it months ago in order to get the book out now. And so I'm thinking these stories are going to be old. Well, it's as if we're writing the headlines of today. We begin the book with the chapter Outlaw Nation. And it starts with Maher Arar. Now, maybe some of you have heard of who he is. Most Americans, I'd say 99%, have never heard that name. Canada, he's a household name. He's a Canadian citizen. And, well, he was born in Syria. In 2002, he was headed through Kennedy Airport ahead of his family a few days from a family vacation. He works for a math computer company, headed back to Canada to do some early work for them. And he's taken by officials, U.S. officials, put in a New York jail for a few weeks, and then he is sent off to, not Canada, where he's been a citizen for decades, but Syria. He begs them, "Don't send me to Syria. I fled when I was 17 with my family. I surely will be tortured." But the U.S. officials get him on one of those Gulfstream jets that are called torture flights. We're talking about this extraordinary term, extraordinary rendition. That's White House for kidnapping. We know it from Latin America, disappearing people. So he's flown across the Atlantic. He's weeping all the way. He is sent to Syria, held in a grave-like cell for almost a year. He is interrogated, he is tortured, and then as inexplicably as he is taken, he is released, a broken man, to Canada. Just this past week, the conservative Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, lodges a protest with the US government for what they did to this man. Why? Because the week before, a Canadian Judicial Commission came out with their more than 100-page report saying Maher Arar is a completely innocent man, and they slammed the US government for what they did to him. And at the same time, you have President Bush speaking at the United Nations General Assembly, calling Syria the crossroads for terrorism. So what is the United States doing, walking hand in hand through those crossroads with Syria? Kidnapping, torture, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, Bagram, the black sites that President Bush recently admitted exist, those sites, those prisons we don't even know about, illegal detention. Now, I think Americans pride themselves on being a model of practice and behavior around the world. But what's going to happen if a US official, a US citizen, a US soldier is captured somewhere in the world and his captors say, we're doing it the American way? This does not represent the best of America. In fact, right after the Raed story went big, oh, by the way, it went very big, the Raed story. NBC picked it up, ABC picked it up. You know, we broke it and they didn't give us credit for it, but that's okay because that's our motto at Democracy Now! Steal this story, please. We call it trickle-up journalism. But, so afterwards, I was invited on MSNBC to talk about Raed's story. And they asked me, in these dangerous times, don't we have to engage in racial profiling? And I said, actually, no. Actually, it puts us in a more dangerous situation. Because if we engage in racial profiling, we're going to miss the next Timothy McVeigh. I mean, you think about what happened, right, 10 years ago, and then McVeigh is arrested, you know, he worked with some other people. Did anyone in this country suggest that all blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white Christian men should be rounded up? Of course not. Because if you believe in law and order, and this is where the lines of conservative and liberal are breaking down, if you believe in law and order, then you believe if there is evidence against someone that they seem to be guilty, the evidence should be amassed, they should be charged, they should be tried, and if found guilty, they should be punished. But that is not what's happening today, and that's what's so frightening. Well, back to the t-shirt story. So the story goes really big, and once these women finish challenging high-flying profiling, we invite one of them onto the show. Her name is Lori Arbeiter. She's the one who gave Raed the t-shirt. And this was their little action. They're a group called Artists Against the War. And since the anniversary of the invasion, March 20th, third anniversary of the invasion. So now we're 3.5 years into the war with Iraq, the current, since the invasion. I mean, it is amazing. We have been involved in Iraq since the invasion longer than the US was involved in World War II. But they decided they would start giving out, selling these t-shirts, and that say "We Will Not Be Silent," and Lori had given Raed this t-shirt, and that's how he got it. So she came on, and now, because this story went so big, they are doing a brisk business in t-shirts. You can email wewillnotbesilent@gmail.com, and that's how you can buy this t-shirt. So it's no formal thing. And they said that because it's gotten so big, they're translated into lots of languages, into Arabic, into Farsi, into Spanish, French, Hebrew, and now they're translating it into the original German. Why German? Well, it comes from the White Rose Collective of World War II, the brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl. They were not Jewish, they were German Christians. And together with some other professors and students, In the face of the Nazi atrocity, they said, what can we do? They decided they'd just give out information so that the Germans would never be able to say, we didn't know. And so they gave out a series of leaflets, 6 in all, I think. The 4th in the series, they gave out thousands of these. The 4th said at the bottom, we will not be silent. Well, Hans and Sophie were arrested by the Nazis, as were the others in their collective. They were tried, they were found guilty, and they were beheaded. But that motto, that philosophy, should be the Hippocratic oath of the media today. We will not be silent. We will not allow others to be silenced. Another lesson the media can learn, I think, goes back in history. As I said, the reason we call it static is also because the media completely ices out movements. So you have someone like Cindy Sheehan who becomes an individual, but not that she was inspired by a movement and that she inspires a movement. Taking people out of context, and it's especially critical for kids because they have to understand how social change happens. How is history made? It comes out of the power of movements. This past year, Rosa Parks died. This pioneering woman who helped to launch the modern-day civil rights movement. Now, the corporate media did cover her story. We headed down to Washington, Democracy Now! With my colleagues, Yoruba Rich and Elizabeth Press, producers at Democracy Now! And she was the first African-American woman to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Then they had a memorial service for her in Washington, then her funeral in Detroit. And the memorial service, thousands of people packed in. It was inside, it was incredible, but outside it was more. That was thousands. It's always more interesting outside. And there were the little kids who were there with their mothers. They were just standing there listening to the loudspeakers. I interviewed a girl in college who said she emailed her professors that day. It said, I'm not coming to class, I'm going to get an education. And I interviewed older women who had sat down on buses before even Rosa Parks in the South and in the North had challenged segregation. It was an incredible moment. Now, the corporate media did cover Rosa Parks, but even covering her, they got it wrong. Because they talked about what she did, December 1st, 1955. She sits down on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and she refuses to get up when the bus driver tells her to stand up so that a white passenger can sit down. And they said she was a tired seamstress. She was no troublemaker. That's where they got it wrong. She was a first-class troublemaker. Being an activist does not detract from your reputation, it enhances it. It means that you are dedicating your life to making the world a better place. And that's what Rosa Parks was doing. She was secretary of the local NAACP. She worked with Edie Nixon. He was president of the NAACP. He came out of radical labor politics. They had been working to challenge segregation. She had actually sat down on the bus before, but this time was the tipping point. And you never know when this tipping point is going to come, just in general. You never know, which is why it is so important to lay the foundation. And the tipping point will probably have nothing to do with what it is that you're working on. Who knows? The Foley scandal, for example. Who would have guessed that this could change the balance of power in Washington? Who would have guessed it? And by the way, it has nothing to do with being gay or straight. Nothing to do. Preying on kids has nothing to do with being gay or straight. But so when he said, when the word came from his lawyer that he admitted he was a gay man, and Newt Gingrich said, we may have known about this before, but we didn't want to be perceived as being anti-gay. The fact is, in the crimes committed against children, they're overwhelmingly heterosexuals that go after the kids. But that's just important to know. But who knows what this tipping point will be? But it's the foundation that you lay that will determine what direction the country will take after that. So here is Rosa Parks, world-class troublemaker. And to show how brave she was, just go back a few months. And she talked about this. Emmett Till. The summer of 1955, his mother, Mamie Till, sends him down from Chicago to get out of the city in the summer to his family in Money, Mississippi, and he's lynched, he's killed by a white mob clan. We don't even know exactly now, 50 years later, the Justice Department is saying they're reopening the investigation. 14-year-old boy, he wolf whistled at a white woman, they said, and he ends up in the bottom of the river, mutilated. And his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, did something amazing. When his body was sent up to Chicago, she said, I want that casket open for the wake, for the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism, the brutality of bigotry. And so thousands streamed by that coffin, and they saw. And then Jet Magazine and other black publications, they published those pictures, and they were seared into the history of this country. Mamie Till has an important lesson to teach the media of today. Show the pictures. It is not your job to whitewash, to sanitize. Show the reality on the ground. I interviewed the former CNN host Aaron Brown. I asked him where those pictures are in Iraq. Why aren't we seeing the pictures that even CNN International shows to show how conscious, how deliberate it is in this country? We live in a globalized world, yet we are so isolated when it comes to information in this country. CNN has two networks. They have CNN International and CNN Domestic. Forget about comparing CNN to Al Jazeera. Compare it to itself. CNN International and Domestic show entirely different images. The day the Saddam Hussein statue went down, we saw it thousands of times in the United States. It's probably become the emblematic image of the invasion. For us, not for the rest of the world, the picture of Saddam going down. But for the rest of the world, what was the picture? Probably the iconic image of this invasion and occupation is the picture of an Iraqi prisoner, arms out, Christ-like figure, electrodes dangling from his fingertips, hood over his head, standing on a box. How is it we have such a different picture in this country than they do in the rest of the world? It's the job of the media to bridge the gap. Now, CNN International, they showed the statue going down, like CNN Domestic, but they knew they couldn't get away with just showing that. And so they showed a split screen, the statue going down and the images of the casualties. So I asked Aaron Brown, where are the images today? Why don't we see the images like we saw in Vietnam, the girl burning with napalm running naked down the street? Where are these pictures that helped to end the Vietnam War? And he said, it's a matter of taste. I think it's war that's tasteless. I want to just end by talking about September 11th, since we've just passed the 5th anniversary, very briefly. September 11th, 2001. Well, I'm from New York, and Democracy Now! Broadcasts from New York, the closest national broadcast to Ground Zero. We're just a few blocks from the World Trade Center where the towers once stood. We broadcast out of a 100-year-old firehouse. 5 years ago, we were broadcasting out of the attic, the garret of this firehouse, and there were no windows. We didn't know what was going on outside. Now we're broadcasting out of the bays of the firehouse where the horse and buggies used to bring out the buckets of water. But it's grown so much that we're now building this entire first floor of the firehouse to work with people and have a training center for young people and old to learn how to do unembedded grassroots global news. By the way, I'm also launching a column on October 24th with King Features called The Same Thing as This Tour, Breaking the Sound Barrier. And any newspaper in the country can take this weekly column, so you can let your local newspapers know. And afterwards, I'm going to sign copies of Static, and if you get two, you get either a DVD hour with Pete Seeger, a wonderful hour we did on Democracy Now!, interviewing him about his life, his activism, his resistance. The other one is Harry Belafonte, an hour and a half that we spent with him in the studio talking about his life, talking about his art. And so you can get two. Why would you want to get two books, two Statics? Well, you could get them for the holidays. You could give one to a library. You can give them as gifts. Well, we have hit number 8 on the New York Times political bestseller list. But on the overall New York Times bestseller list, we've hit like 18 or 20. It goes back and forth each week, 20, 22, 18. If we hit 15, we will be printed in the pages of the New York Times in that list. And why is that important? Well, we offer some very fierce criticism of the New York Times, which we feel very much acted as a conveyor belt for the lies of the administration. In our first book, Exception to the Rulers, we had a chapter called Lies of Our Times. Maybe that's why they didn't review it, and they certainly won't review this one, but still it would get in those pages whether they like it or not. And it's very important for people who read the Times to see this kind of critique of their Bible. But also, unlike Mac's Backs, there are a lot of bookstores, the non-independents, that just stock the bestsellers, the New York Times bestsellers. And there are a lot of very good people who go into these chain stores looking for good information. And so that is why it's also so important to reach out into the mainstream to give people access to this whole universe of ideas and independent media. Because the mainstream in this country, I very much think, are those who are opposed to war. Those opposed to war are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media. The mainstream media is no longer mainstream. They are extreme. So September 11th, we're broadcasting out of the garret of the firehouse. We now broadcast at 8 in the morning, then we're broadcasting at 9. 8:47, the first plane hits. We didn't know what happened outside. We have no windows. We're preparing our show. 9 o'clock hits, we start our show. 9:03, the second plane hits the second tower. We were doing a special that day on the connection between terror and September 11th, 1973. The day Salvador Allende died in the palace in Chile, the democratically elected leader of Chile. As the Pinochet forces rose to power, the US-backed Pinochet forces, the Nixon-backed, Kissinger-backed, ITT-backed Pinochet forces, killing thousands of people over the next 17 years. And that's not the only time that September 11th is connected to this date. September 11th, 1990, Guatemalan anthropologist Myrna Mack died at the hands of Guatemalan security forces, US-backed Guatemalan security forces. When I was speaking in Denver, a Guatemalan family came up to me afterwards, and the mother said, "Thank you for mentioning Myrna. She was my dear friend." September 11th, 1977, Steve Biko, South Africa, founder of the Black Consciousness Movement, was being beaten to death in the back of a van by apartheid forces, US-backed apartheid forces. He died in the early morning of September 12th, 1977. When I was in Minneapolis, I learned September 12th is Leonard Peltier's birthday. He's been in prison for decades. And that day in Minneapolis was the day I met Mike Kuzma, his attorney, who had just been in court appealing for 90,000 pages in Leonard Peltier's case. When they did the trial decades ago, they thought they had all the pages, 1,800. Now they're appealing for 90,000 pages, and that's only from one FBI office in Minneapolis. They've been denied on national security grounds. The trial was 30 years ago. September 11th, 1971, Attica, the prisoner uprising, upstate New York. 2 days later, then New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller called out the New York State Troopers. They opened fire and they killed 39 men, prisoners and guards. And only this past week have some guards' families gotten some compensation. They were lied to at the time. They were told that the guards were killed by the prisoners. Not one guard was killed by a prisoner. There was a suppressed coroner's report that showed every guard was killed in the so-called turkey shoot when the troopers opened fire, and the prisoners killed as well. 88 prisoners critically wounded and hundreds of others injured. September 11th is not the first time that terror came to US soil. Ask any African American about slavery. Ask any Native American about what has happened in this country. But September 11th, 2001 was a horrific moment. 3,000 people incinerated in an instant. We'll never actually know how many people died on that day, because those who go uncounted in life go uncounted in death. And they were the undocumented workers who worked at the World Trade Center. And we should know their names, we should know their stories. That's what dignifies a life. So after the attacks, we stayed inside the firehouse. Everyone was evacuated now in our whole area. We were within the evacuation zone. But we felt it was critical to keep broadcasting, closest national broadcast to Ground Zero, as the war machine was gearing up in Washington, what was being projected in corporate networks and certainly to the rest of the world did not reflect what was happening in New York. I think a sticker better reflected it. Our grief is not a cry for war. Thousands of people went into the parks with candles, with flowers. They were talking, they were weeping, they were debating, they were discussing. And we started to broadcast the voices of people like Rita Lasar. She lost her brother Abe Zalmanowitz on the 27th floor of the World Trade Center. He worked for Blue Cross Blue Shield. He worked next to his best friend, Ed, who was a paraplegic. Abe's brother screamed at him on the cell phone to get out now, and Abe said, as soon as they come get Ed, as soon as the emergency workers come out, we'll go down together. And they died with so many others. Well, Rita wrote a letter to the New York Times after President Bush gave his speech at the National Cathedral a few days later, invoking Abe's story, calling him a national hero. And she said no. She wrote this letter where she said that it would only increase her suffering to know that a woman in Afghanistan would soon lose her brother. She said, not in my name, not in my brother's name. And Phyllis and Orlando Rodriguez, who lost their son Gregor Nestor Rodriguez above the 100th floor. He worked for Cantor Fitzgerald. They lost 700 of 1,000 workers. And they wrote a letter to President Bush. It didn't get published. It swirled around the internet, said the same thing. It would not lessen their pain to know that a mother and father in Afghanistan would soon lose their son. They said, not in our name, not in our son's name. And this nationwide movement grew up. September 11th, Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, not in our name. And sometimes we saw them on television describing their loved ones. But when they moved from description to prescription, what should happen? That's when the media cut away. And they would go to the terrorism experts, the Oliver Norths and the Henry Kissingers. Well, maybe the media got it right in that case. They are the experts. It takes one to know one. And I don't say that lightly. You look at Kissinger's role in Chile, his support of Pinochet, the thousands of Chileans who died. You look at his role in Argentina, supporting the generals in the dirty war, the 30,000 Argentines who were killed. You look at his role in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Millions died. You look at his role with President Ford. They went to Indonesia in 1975, met with Suharto, the long-reigning dictator, and gave the go-ahead for Indonesia's invasion of Timor. The Indonesian military, 90% of the weapons used were from the United States. They closed East Timor to the outside world, and over the next 2 decades, they massacred the people. They killed off 1/3 of the population, one of the great genocides of the 20th century. I do think that Osama bin Laden and his accomplices should be tried, and if found guilty, they should be punished. But I also think that Henry Kissinger should be tried for war crimes. Now, that is precisely why the White House, quietly first, and now not so quietly, is trying to change the 1996 War Crimes Act. We already know how many times the Geneva Conventions have been violated. Actually, we don't know how many times, but we already know they've been violated. But we're not talking international law now. We're talking U.S. law. They're trying to change the War Crimes Act because they don't want to be held accountable. Now CIA agents who go abroad are taking out insurance. They're afraid. You know, as I talked about extraordinary rendition, there are Italian prosecutors who are now bringing charges against 24 CIA agents for abducting a sheikh off the streets of Milan and sending him off to be tortured. They don't want to be held accountable. We have to have a uniform standard of justice. If it's not okay for them over there in other countries, it's not okay for us. In those days, and here I'll end with this image, in those days after September 11th, those color Xeroxes went up all over, thousands of them. Color Xeroxes on lampposts and park benches and the sides of hospitals and all over the parks of New York. Xeroxes of photographs of loved ones lost in the World Trade Center. There would be a picture of a woman holding her child, and it would say, if you've seen my wife last seen in Tower 1, please call her husband with a phone number. Or a picture of a young man, if you've seen my son last seen in Tower 2, please call his father and a phone number. And I thought about how similar those pictures were to those carried in the placards by the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina as they walk the Plaza de Mayo. Have you seen my grandson? Have you seen my granddaughter? September 11th united us with people around the world against terror. Terror has one definition. It's the killing of innocent civilians, whether done by individuals or done by states. We come from the most powerful country on earth. It has the most powerful military on earth. What we do matters. Every little act we engage in has a ripple effect all over the world. Whether we are journalists or students, whether we're professors, doctors, nurses, artists, whether we are truck drivers or shopkeepers or librarians, whether we're at the beginning of our careers or at the end of our careers, whether we're employed or unemployed, we have a decision to make every hour of every day, and that is whether to represent the sword or the shield. Democracy Now!